Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the mind's eye. I'm your host, DJ BJ Turnof, and you're finally going to hear the origin of that name. I'm standing at the intersection of history and mystery, science and the strange, and crime and the sublime, a true auditorium of audacity. This edition of the Mind's Eye is something completely different. Tonight's guest is it's me. No, it's not some weird joke where I'm going to interview myself. I know normally I'm the one asking the questions, and you only get to hear my perspective of them really at a minimum. But I recently guested on a friend of our podcast. That is none other than Laura London, Speaking of Young. You might recognize the name from our own archives when we interviewed her a few years back. We talked about Carl Jung and some of his occult beliefs. I spoke with Laura last week on one of these great quarantine episodes and shared my personal experiences and research into the weird and wonderful. I figured, hey, I might as well share that interview with my normal listeners so you can know the moments that have carved out my perspective as your host of this show. Now, if you love me so much, you can hear the whole interview at speakingofyoung.com, but I'm just going to play the highlights for you. I'm going to tell you about my Freemason experience, what I've learned about the location of the Knights Templar treasure, and what I think is the best way to solve the Oak Island mystery. I'll also break down our modern superstition about the number 13 and connect that to important historical events to history about the Knights Templar and Jesus Christ. In the second half, we get real weird and freaky with it, where I talk about my personal ghost story and paranormal experiences at the Houghton Mansion, as well as a 200-year-old ghost story about George Washington that I found during research. And speaking of research, I'm going to give you the piles of evidence that I think proves that there was a conspiracy behind the Martin Luther King Jr. assassination. You know, a skeptic like me, if I'm going to put out something like a ghost story or point the finger at a faction of the government behind the Martin Luther King assassination, then I'm going to at least provide some evidence. I'm going to tell you where you can find my personal EVP, electronic voice phenomena, recordings of a ghost voice that I heard. And then I'll give you all my sources about the MLK conspiracy. And finally, I'll wrap it up talking about my strange synchronicities during my time living in Los Angeles that have helped guide my life and really get to this moment talking to you. Stay tuned for this one-time Mind's Eye experience like never before, maybe never again. I'll be right back with, well, yours truly. This is the Mind's Eye.
This is Laura London, and you're listening to a special quarantine edition of Speaking of Young. Joining us for the third edition in this series is the creator and host of the Mind's Eye show, Mr. BJ Turnof in Baltimore, Maryland. Since 2009, Brian has been moonlighting as a paranormal investigator and researcher. He took the position of resident skeptic, initially intrigued by a personal search for the existence of spirits based on a deep fear of death. He has conducted lectures and workshops about various paranormal and non-paranormal topics at public libraries and schools along the East Coast. Brian is best known as DJ BJ Turnof, host of the long-running podcast The Mind's Eye. Created in 2014, the show thoughtfully examines wide-ranging topics with a focus on cutting-edge scientific theories, current and historical events, morality and politics, as well as pop culture and the esoteric. His guests include the late Dr. Stanton Friedman, Robert Bauval, Rick Strassman, Nick Redfern, Robert Schock, and our friend Jimmy Church. With his characteristic open-minded perspective, Brian often veers listeners into new and unexpected territories. As an experienced secondary school teacher, he is intimately aware of how history is written by the winners through educational gaps and disinformation, ultimately blurring the lines between reality and fiction. By shining a light on the hidden, often dirty crevices of history, the show hopes to find kernels of truth and give voice to the voiceless. The Mind's Eye can be heard every Thursday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Stitcher Radio and Z-Talk Radio. This interview is being recorded on Wednesday, May 20th, 2020. Hi, Brian.
Hello, hello.
Hi.
And anyone who out there who's doubting my name is actually BJ Turnof. I got a license that proves you otherwise. That is my actual real name.
Your real name is BJ.
BJ Turnof. That is when you're born with a name like that, you have to, I guess, be born with a bit of a sense of humor for sure.
So it's Turnof or Turnoff?
It's really Turnof, but at this point,
with a V.
Yeah,
but
well, it's with
guys
an F.
change the
It's one
spelling?
F, but it used to be Turnovsky. And then when my family went through the Port of Philadelphia, they didn't go through Ellis Island.
Okay.
It was changed then to Turnof. It's Polish.
It's Polish.
But here's actually a funny little thing, which I was told, whether
Yeah.
this story is true or not, a little family story, is that our name once was Crystal. And this was in Poland.
What?
But one of my family members married into a family that only had daughters. So he took their last name, Turnovsky, which then eventually became Turnov. And here I am, BJ Turnof.
Got it. Wait, Crystal?
Crystal, yeah. That used to be,
Okay.
or it's from what I'm told, that's what it was. So
Okay.
BJ,
And-
so Brian Crystal, I mean, god damn, that's a name and a half for a podcast. But you know what? DJ BJ Turnof works for me, and it kind of works for what I'm doing here.
I love it. I love it. So we are both native New Yorkers, and
Yeah.
it takes one to know one, baby.
It takes one
Right?
asshole to know another asshole.
Exactly,
right? Yeah.
exactly. And so I have to squash that, hide that, not only because I live in Chicago, which is my adopted hometown. I've only been here, I've been here actually for 16 years, which is a long time, but I'm a native New Yorker. You know, my parents both grew up in New York City. My brother and I were born there. We grew up there. And where exactly were you born?
Plainview. So I'm a Long Island boy. What about you?
Well, I was born in Queens.
Oh, Queens girl, we got here. What part?
Jackson Heights.
Okay, yeah. And you know, here's a kind of a funny thing that people don't realize. Brooklyn, Queens, Nassau, Suffolk County, that's actually all part of Long Island. That's all
Yeah.
part of, a lot of people, when they don't really realize that. When I tell them that, they're kind of shocked. But, talking to another New Yorker that's, been there, done that type of information.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I'm grabbing this book because I lost my notes, Being a Freemason, because Jung's grandfather was a Freemason. And I want you to tell us a little bit about what that means, what that is.
Well, I mean, I think what prompted me to want to look into being a Freemason is I'm a big history lover, so particularly American history. I'm born in USA, so it's what I like. And as probably a lot of people know, a lot of listeners, a good amount of the presidents were Masons, and I always wonder, why are so many presidents, people who are considered, leaders of the free world, why are they Masons? And I mean, on a side note, who doesn't also want to be in a secret society? Let's be serious here.
Right.
It's kind of cool
Right.
just saying it. But really looking into it, because none of my family members were Freemasons that I'm aware of,
Okay.
is that their beliefs really kind of align with my beliefs: diversity, acceptance, equality. And there's this phrase in Freemasonry, on the level, and it shows you equality. It means no matter where you are in your status in life, we are all the same. So you could be president or you could be janitor, right? But you're still the same when you're wherever you are. You're equal. And there's this like really cool Freemason legend, and whether it's true or not, it's exactly that, right? So there's the president of the United States. He's a Freemason. One of the presidents in the 20th century. There's also a janitor for the White House. They're both Freemasons at the same lodge, and they're at a lodge meeting together. But the janitor is worshipful master or some other position that is really high, and the president is just is not one of those high positions. But there are certain times during meetings that you kind of have this act of reverence that you do for someone in a position, and the president had no problem doing that with the janitor. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, so and whether that's true or not, who knows? But it's kind of a microcosm of the belief system that I'm particularly interested with. Freemasons and what made me want to join. So I joined in 2009. I'm kind of a small fries guy, third degree Master Mason, which is pretty much the basic thing that you can do. And the reason for that is I joined in 2009. I was living in Maryland at the time, and about 2 months after I got in, I got offered a job in New York. So then I moved to New York. I moved around a bunch of times. I was in Brooklyn, Long Island. Then I moved to Los Angeles. I moved around there once a year. So literally once a year I moved for the last 10 years or so. And it's really hard to pursue your degree work to advance in it if you can't go to any meetings. So I'm a small fries guy, like I said, Master Mason, but the way I continuously and today interact and look into Freemasonry and connect with it is I do a lot of historical research, and some of that is Masonic related. So yeah, I'm a Freemason. I love the history behind it. I love the, occult information, the hidden information that they reveal to you, even though mine is obviously very minimal. So I think it's pretty interesting. And you said before that Jung was grandfather was a Freemason, and at that time Freemasonry was really a fabric of people's lives. And Jung, to me, from the outside looking, to me he looks like a perfect candidate to be a Freemason. Why is that something that he never pursued himself?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Probably because he didn't have the time, but I have no way of knowing. So it was his father's father. And his name was Carl Gustav Jung, and they kind of jokingly refer to him as C.G. Jung the First, because
the OG.
Jung's name. What do you mean?
The original gangsta.
The original, yes. Sorry. I didn't hear what you said. Yeah. So the name skipped a generation. So it was his grandfather's name, it's his name. And yeah, he was this larger than life figure. And I have so many questions I want to ask you about it, because I compiled my own list of Jung and the number 13. But before I tell you about that, I'd like to know, you also refer to it as a secret society, and I'm wondering, how secretive is it if everybody knows about it?
Yeah, it's the worst kept secret in the world right now.
Right.
The thing is that not everything is revealed, right? So,
right.
You could find, like I said, I'm a small fries guy, third degree Mason. You can literally find every single degree, first, second, third degree, up until the third degree, somewhere online. You can know exactly what the rituals were. Having said that, you don't get the interpretation from the Masons themselves just by reading it online. So it's the worst kept secret. But even though they tell you you can know the content, but you may not actually know the content unless you're really within it. So kind of like in some ways, it's kind of like the Bible, at least how I view the Bible. And I don't want to turn off half the listeners here, but to me, it seems like a collection of stories that has truth in it, but it's there to teach you a lesson, and that's essentially what Freemasonry is. It's nonfiction within a work of fiction to teach you something.
The reason why I brought up the number 13 is because Robert Sullivan alerted me to that. Is there some significance to that in Freemasonry, the number 13?
I'm not aware of it, but what did Robert Sullivan say about the number 13 and within Freemasonry?
I think if I remember correctly, he tied it into the Friday the 13th and why.
Oh, okay,
and how.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because Freemasonry is considered to be an offshoot of the Knights Templar. They might be, our forefathers, so to speak, in some way. Some people believe that. So the number 13.
Do you not believe that?
I think it's definitely a possibility. I think that might be something that you learn later on at some point, which is maybe a reason why it's believed. But there is some overlapping evidence that there might be a connection there, particularly with maybe some ritual work or something like that. But with Friday the 13th, so Knights Templars are considered to be maybe our forefathers, and so the Knights Templar, they were for those listeners not familiar, they were a Catholic military order. They defended the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They protected Christians who were doing their pilgrimage, and this was during the Crusades time. They were founded, I think, in the early 1119, I think it was, something to that. And then pretty much over the next 2 centuries, they amassed a ridiculous amount of wealth and land. And when you amass a ridiculous amount of wealth and land, someone's going to want to come for it. And that's exactly what I think King Philip the 9th or 10th, something, I think it was the 9th, who did exactly that. And at the time, if you wanted to attack somebody and to justify your actions of killing and torturing them, pretty much all you had to say was heresy, magic, and that's pretty much what he did. So he was able. So on Friday the 13th. 1307, another part of the 13 right there. Friday the 13th, 1307. That was the day a large amount, or supposedly a large amount, of Knights Templars were apprehended and then subsequently killed there afterwards.
Yeah, yeah. And so
I actually think that just to go with the 13 thing, people that's why Friday the 13th is considered bad luck. I actually think there's another reason why the number 13 is considered bad luck with a historical event.
Oh, tell me.
So Jesus Christ, right? 12 apostles, the Last Supper. So 12 apostles, Jesus Christ. He was 1, 12 plus 1, 13, Last Supper. We all know what happened from there.
Right.
So I think that there might be some relationship there to a reason why why there's so much superstitions over 13. I mean, it's such an interesting number. I mean, 13, and why there's so many superstitions. I mean, we make these accommodations for the number 13 and the superstition. So listeners, if people, particularly in cities, if you go into buildings that are 13 floors plus and you're on the elevator, take a look at the elevator. You might see that the number 13 isn't actually depicted on the elevator. You'll see 12A, you'll see 12B, but you won't see the number 13.
Right.
And then also, I think with the number 13, that with buildings, because I used to be a home inspector and a business inspector, there actually are a lot of floors. The 13th floor is a lot of times used as a mechanical floor. They won't put like an actual office on there. So it's interesting with the number 13 how we make accommodations for these interesting these superstitions.
Yeah, in present day. And you recently interviewed a hero of mine, William Mann.
Yes,
who
fascinating.
Not only is a Freemason, but he is a member of the Knights Templar. Is that right?
Yes, real deal Knights Templar. People think the Knights Templar is something of the past, but no, they're still going on, and they're still here. Real deal.
Do you know him?
So we had a really fascinating interview. I never met him. I just happened to reach out to him about his book because he just came out with a new book.
Right.
And he accepted the interview. I think I mentioned something that I was a Freemason, so maybe that kind of got me a little foot in the door. But yeah, we ended up having like a really interesting conversation about the Knights Templar treasure, because there's this legend that when we talked about Friday the 13th, so the Knights Templars had a lot of them had to flee from this persecution. So supposedly they took their treasure with them. Why do people think that they had this treasure, right? Because they were originally headquartered in Temple Mount in Jerusalem for the first 20 years of their existence. Then they were in the Vatican. So some people think they have this treasure. It could be gold, could be ancient knowledge, could be some type of ancient artifact. So we talked about where is this treasure. And he came out with this book. It's called Last Refuge of the Knights Templar. And it's essentially a fictional book. It's kind of like a Da Vinci Code style book, but classic, secret side Knights Templar type people. It's truth within this fiction. So the book is actually based on these real letters. It was a recent discovery between Albert Pike and another really big famous Mason of the 19th century. And inside those letters, so Albert Pike, let me just kind of talk about him for a second. He was a Confederate. He was a Confederate general. He's clearly a piece of shit, but he's confounding in history and very controversial.
Right.
And he's. But side note, as a Freemason, he's probably one of the most knowledgeable Freemasons, and really about ancient knowledge, hidden knowledge that there is. So inside these letters, these correspondences that he's having with this Scottish Rite Freemason, he supposedly told where the actual treasure is. And supposedly, according to this book, and according to him in these letters, the treasure is somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. And he tried to be, and he was pretty specific with where it was, as specific as he could be. So it's pretty interesting with William F. Mann in his new book. I mean, I recommend. He talks about the I mean, you can kind of find out where the treasure is, and just to kind of note what the treasure is, I asked him what it is. He wouldn't tell me what it is, but he told me that the plan is for 5 years, for sometime in the next 5 years, that whatever the treasure is, because there are people who know where it is, and there's companies that have bought the land where supposedly this treasure is. They're Masonic related as well, or Knights Templar related. And supposedly in the next 5 years, they're going to tell us what the treasure is, what this final Knights Templar treasure is. But it exists, supposedly.
And it's not buried underneath Oak Island.
It's not buried underneath Oak Island, even though that's one of the places that supposedly where it is.
Damn show. I mean, I'm still watching that thing. Oh, it's, what is it, the 5th or 6th season?
I think it might even be up to 7. I'm embarrassed to say this, but I've never watched one episode of it, even though I interviewed.
Are you kidding me?
And this is something I owned up to the guest, Randall Sullivan, who's if you watch the show.
I didn't. Yeah, I listened to that episode. You told him you've never watched it. I missed that. I must have blocked it.
Yeah, it was
out.
like it was like the first thing I said to him. I said, I'm going to admit to this, but I've never watched the show. I mean, of course, I'm interested in it, so I'm familiar with the information.
How could you not watch? Because it's not there, right?
I just think, you know what? Some of the shows I get into. I also didn't have cable for a really long time, so there was that. And then some of it, you know what? It's like any other show. There's some truth, and then a lot of that's edited into a narrative that they want to put out there. That I don't even think a lot of like the Lagina brothers even believe.
To see the Lagina brothers struggle, they just look so beaten down.
Oh my god! And it's funny that the name Money Pit, right? That's the part of the earthworks that was found there. It's the tunnel that's like 100, 200 feet deep, and every 10 feet there's a wooden platform. And I think that's the most appropriate name for it, because for over 200 years, people have just been throwing their money into it and not getting almost anything in it.
I don't see how you can even set foot on that island anymore. It's so unstable. The land there's a big swamp.
Well, I think only like 5 people live there, right? Something to that effect.
And they keep dying.
And they can't. Well, yeah, I mean, it's dangerous when you're doing that type of work, right? I mean, that was kind of the point of the money pit, or supposedly the point of the money pit was to try and keep people out of something that could be, a treasure, maybe.
But to make a show around finding a coin, a button, a piece of wood, they're really not getting anywhere. And then to hear William Mann, or to see, that in his book he mentions that it's not even in that general area. With the thing, so I had shared with you a personal story about, and I don't want to get into it here, about how William Mann changed my life, but I'll never forget, what he did for me, and I'll always have a place in my heart for him. He, in his work and his research, but one of the things he told you on the episode that you just recently did with him is that the knowledge is the real treasure, right? So people think that it's gold and it's money and it's jewels, and it's the knowledge. And his attitude about it, I really love.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it seems. So let's say, I mean, to me, it seems like he really wants this information out there. And the people who know where the treasure is, they know that he knows. So that's why maybe I don't know if this 5-year timeline was given to him or that's self-imposed, but I have a feeling that at some point, this information, if it is true, William Mann's going to come out with the information if they don't come out with it. If it's on his deathbed, if it's somewhere in his will, I think just talking to him, I have a feeling he wants this information out there. He said it's knowledge. I definitely think it's knowledge, but I also do think it's actual some type of treasure, gold or money also.
Yeah.
What that knowledge is, I mean, who knows? I mean, what do you think this knowledge could be? What are your thoughts on it?
It's just that there are so few clues in this whole puzzle, and the shows are created and they keep repeating the same things. And so I just feel like we're really not getting anywhere.
And it's almost kind of like a Rorschach test. So like whatever your bias is, you can use whatever evidence that they found there for it, or some of it, and disregard the rest. I mean, but they've found some pretty interesting stuff. I mean, they found crosses that had to be man-made. They found, a large cross over like 100 yards that was built from stone. So, I mean, there's some pretty interesting finds there. And I think that on Oak Island, They find like 100 feet deep bones, and supposedly the bones, whether this is real or not, if it was contaminated or not, who knows? But supposedly the ancestry of those bones one is European and one is Middle Eastern. So let's say you wanted to say the Knights Templar treasure is there, or some type of treasure like that is there, secret society, Freemason related. I mean, you could probably find a reason for it. They say that for all the earthworks that were done there to make that money pit 200 feet deep with those platforms, to have the built a flood system in there as well, it would have had to take hundreds of thousands of hours of manpower. So that means you would have had to need access to a lot of men that knew how to do earthworks, that knew how to do stonework, who also could keep a secret, right? Because we don't know anything about what this really is. They found crosses. If the bones of the ancestry of those bones are real, I mean, a lot of that you could say adds up to Knights Templar, right?
Okay, so even if the Knights Templar were at Oak Island,
which I don't think it is, but I'm saying my point is that you could. I don't, because of what William F. Mann said. I'm going to take it from a real deal Knights Templar. Maybe one of their treasures is there because they fled into different areas.
Right, but what I was going to say, I'm sorry to jump in here, but what I was going to say is that I think they went through there. So what I was getting at was that if you leave Portugal to head toward North America, you're going to hit that area first. You could, right? You're going to hit that area first. So you're going to hang out there for a while and be on your way. So I don't think that they stopped at Oak Island and they buried their treasure there. Or maybe they did something. Those wooden planks, though,
well,
right? Maybe that's why
it's interesting.
I was so hooked.
But supposedly, so there's this new book that came out on Oak Island. I think it came out last year. I probably should throw an invitation out there just so I can get the other side of it. Yeah. They proposed that there was evidence that there was some type of early manufacturing company in the 17th century, which would predate near the time of when those discoveries were. So if there was an early manufacturing company there, maybe they could have dug that somehow. Who knows? I don't know if that's true, but I think it's an interesting mundane theory.
And that could be a myth too. Those planks.
I mean, I don't know exactly, because that's the whole problem. Is that because the further you dig down, so like we said before, there was this flood system. So you dig down, you would trigger something, it would flood the whole place. You keep digging down, and by now, what they call the money pit is actually not where the original location. It's nearby, but it's not the original one. So.
And for everybody listening, if you're not familiar, the name of the show is The Curse of Oak Island, and it airs on the History Channel. And
I have an episode of a similar name, so if you want to hear it, definitely, I have all my archives up there for free.
I will put a link to that. I'm going to write it down. I will put a link to that in the show notes on speakingofyoung.com. Right. So what Randall Sullivan told you is he said that his military buddies said they could solve this in one day if they were allowed access to that island. Because every episode of this show, they have some boring company, some drilling company, some excavator there digging. A diver. They had so many episodes with divers going down into the water to see what they can find, and nobody finds anything but a piece of wood or a stone in the shape of a triangle. Come on.
What they should be looking for, and I don't know, I haven't watched the recent episodes, they should be looking for some type of another entry. If this really is hiding something, a treasure, or did at some point, there has to be another access point. So if this was built over 200 years ago because of beach erosion, the access point would probably be somewhere offshore, 30, 40, 50 feet, something like that. So if they really wanted to solve it, this is what they should be looking for.
Well, let me ask you, so who were some of your favorite guests?
Well, outside of Laura London, who's one of my all-time favorites, obviously. Oh, God. That's a good question. It's kind of funny. And this is probably a crappy analogy, but it's kind of like I'm a parent, right? I have all these little babies, and you don't have a favorite. But let's be serious. Every parent really has a favorite, so I'll tell you a couple.
Okay.
A couple months ago, I interviewed DEA agent Steve Murphy and Javier Pena. They were the agents who helped take down Pablo Escobar, the same agents who are depicted that the first 2 seasons of Netflix Narcos series is based off of. I spoke with National Ranger Andrea Langford about some haunting and ghost stories in national parks. The one that you didn't want to listen to because you were scared. I spoke to journalist Tom O'Neill about the Manson murders, and he gave us some couple interesting connections that talks about the CIA and FBI's involvement in it.
Okay.
So yeah, I really and they range from all over the place. So I love music episodes. So I recently did an episode with music journalist Chris Welch. He had he had some decades spanning interviews with Eric Clapton. So it was Eric Clapton's 75th birthday, and I want to do a little celebration of him.
Yeah.
So we do a little bit of everything, and I love music episodes. I love true crime episodes. As disturbing as they are, they're always interesting.
What do you mean by music episodes?
I've done episodes about Eric Clapton, Bob Dylan, Otis.
You mean about their biographies? About their lives?
It's a biographical episode that is premised, or what prompted it would be an anniversary. So, for example, it was the 75th birthday for Eric Clapton a couple months ago. For Bob Dylan a few years ago was his 75th birthday. Sublime, it was the 25th anniversary of the release of 40 Ounces to Freedom. So some type of anniversary will prompt it, and I'll do some type of biographical work and hopefully get as closest to the source as possible. So if you're a big ska, reggae, punk fan and you like Sublime, I did 2 interviews, one with Todd Zulkins, who was best friends with Bradley Noel, the lead singer of Sublime, and the band. So it's just a biographical episode. I try to get as close as possible, and I love music, and I love to talk about music, and it seems to be a pretty big hit with listeners. They always seem to be pretty highly rated.
Then we went to Rick Strassman. So
yes.
You talked to him about, I think he has a new book on DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, a new science of spiritual revelation in the Hebrew Bible. And Dr. Strassman is a professor in New Mexico, and I met him at a book signing in Santa Fe when his seminal book on DMT, The Spirit Molecule, came out. And that book has been referenced so much. I've never done DMT. Have you?
I have not, although I've been in the presence of someone who has, yes.
Oh, you have? Okay.
I think it's pretty quick from if I recall correctly. It doesn't really last that long. But it seems like when you're going through it, from how it was described, almost of a religious, spiritual effect.
Yeah.
So that's why he came out with that book, which connects why people believe that there might be, I think it's a spiritual world, and the connection between that and DMT. And DMT is a natural, I believe, a hormone that is actually produced naturally in the body.
Dimethyltryptamine.
Yes, thank you. I wasn't even going to try and pronounce it, so I'm glad that you could. But yeah, so it's something that we produce naturally in it, and he was trying to make connections. Maybe that could be a reason why there's this idea of, that we think that there's some type of spiritual existence or plane, or there's something else out there.
What do you think?
When it comes to DMT, or when it comes to...
when it comes to, because in my intro for you, did you catch what I said about your initial kind of where this all came from?
Yeah, my foray into it. So.
Yeah, your foray into it is your fear of death and wanting to know if there is proof of life after life.
Yeah, so for some reason I've always had this death anxiety.
Yeah,
me too. So
Honestly,
what it's like.
Me too. Yeah.
So sometimes if you can compulsively think about death, and you do that, for me particularly, if there isn't no light, what freaks me out is the idea that there's blackness, right, after death, that we don't exist.
Black velvet.
Yeah, there's nothing, right? I love life. I love sensing. I love feeling. I love my friends. I love my family. And the fact that if there is nothing after this, it is depressing as hell. And it used to cause a lot of depression and anxiety for me. It still does. I just had a panic attack about it, a month ago. And now they're rare and few and far between. But that's what prompted me into, looking into the paranormal, particularly into the afterlife, because it kept causing this anxiety, and I just couldn't get away from these compulsive thoughts about death and blackness. So that's what prompted me into becoming, for a while there, doing a lot of paranormal research and investigation. I probably did thousands of hours in a 6-year span. I probably did thousands of hours of investigation, hundreds of locations, and in that time, maybe I can say 20 to 30 minutes of that total is unexplainable. Okay. But those 20 and 30 minutes, that they stay with me, and it has helped me. It showed me that there might be something afterwards, something afterlife, that consciousness does exist afterwards, and it's helped me, progress through anxiety issues. I could talk about it if you want, what that investigation was.
I would love for you to tell us about
that. But yeah, so that's what prompted me into it. So I did a solo investigation. It was 2014, so a little while ago now at this point. I did an investigation at the Houghton Mansion. That's based in North Adams, Massachusetts. It's on the border of Vermont. It's been featured on a couple of those, paranormal shows, which I'm sure people watch. So I'll kind of set the scene here a little bit for you, tell you, because when it comes to paranormal stuff, ghosts, the history is really important. So if you can match some type of explainable phenomena with the history, ding, 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 you found something that you can maybe say is substantive as evidence for, paranormal. So I went to Houghton Mansion. It's named after A.C. Houghton. He was a Freemason himself. He was the first mayor of North Adams. On August 1st, 1914, him, his daughter, a couple of friends, and then his butler, longtime butler, Mr. Witters, they went out for a little joyride. This is 1914, so at the time, there's really nothing. There's a joyride, but every joyride is dangerous just because of the infancy of paved roads at that time. Cars only existed for 30 years at that point, not even. So they went on a little joyride. They were on this road. It was being blocked by this stable by this team of horses. They tried passing on the left. But unfortunately, something happened to their car, and it essentially propped down this deep embankment. The car was rolling over and over. Mary, the daughter of A.C. Houghton, she was stuck inside the car, so she was rolling over and over inside this car. She died later on. Everybody else was hurled from the car. One person, Mrs. Huntington, the friend, she died pretty much instantaneously. Mary died later in the hospital. There's 3 men in it that actually only came away with scratches, but this event kind of prompted this unbelievable chain of deaths, pretty much. So Mary died that night. Mrs. Huntington died during the event. Later on that night, Mr. Witters, who I told you before was the butler, he was driving the car. He was there for like 30-plus years with the family, so he's really more of like an uncle. He felt extremely guilty. He went into the barn around, sometime after 1:30 or so, really early in the morning, late night, and killed himself. 10 days later, 10 days later, Mr. Houghton, A.C. Houghton, who the mansion is named after, he died from actual internal hemorrhaging, which they didn't realize that he had. And a few days after Mr. Houghton, or sometime shortly after Mr. Houghton, Mr. Huntington, the father of the female neighbor who died instantaneously, he committed suicide. Then 2 years later, Mrs. Houghton, wife of A.C., mother of Mary, she passed away in the same bedroom as A.C. Houghton.
Jesus.
So this tragic event, August 1st, 1914, it set off this chain of events which people believe have influenced these hauntings. So I actually was able to do, as a Mason, I was kind of got me that good old foot in the door, and luckily I was able to do an investigation. So in 1926, the remaining daughter of A.C. Houghton, they pretty much just gifted the mansion to the Masons.
Okay.
A couple of years
okay.
ago, they actually couldn't afford, now we're touching on coming back to something that we said before, they couldn't even afford to live there, so they ended up selling it. So I'm really thankful to have this experience. But since that time when the Masons took it over, pretty much this has run the whole ghost paranormal gamut. Voices, shadows, sensation of touching, everything that you can think of when it comes to ghosts. So I was doing an investigation there. I was in the lodge room. It was built a year after the Masons took over. It's the only addition to the home. Everything else still retains pretty much the originality of it for the most part, outside of, construction updates. So I was doing an EVP session. Essentially, you're just asking questions to hopefully you get answers in response. I was doing it through this thing called the Ghost Box, and what that does, it's a tool. It scans the FM and AM frequencies and produces white noise, and supposedly ghost spirits can use this white noise to produce words. So I was asking,
wait, to produce
words from their side. So if I ask a question, they can answer through that white noise. Okay. So I was doing an EVP session, electronic voice phenomena, and so I was recording it. And I was asking these questions. When you're asking these questions, you try to get as personal as possible. So I was just, or you also go generic. So I was asking these questions. I was in the lodge. It was probably around 1:30 in the morning or so. And I asked, do you have I was doing the session, getting nothing. And then I asked, do you have a message for somebody? And the answer I hear, everyone, because how it sounds like kind of like a digital voice. So so it said, so I get the word everyone. And it was pretty clear as day. There's there's different types of EVPs, A, B, C, and A is the clearest, C is like, barely discernible. And this is what I consider an A EVP. You can hear it pretty clearly. I repeat, who do you want? So I ask, who do you want to give the message to? They say the same answer, everyone. I then ask, who do you want to give the message to? Clear as day, I get the word Douglas. I don't know who the hell Douglas is. In my research, in my research, everything I just talked about, there's no Douglas at all. So it turns out I was doing the solo investigation, but one of the brothers with me. It turns out the name Douglas, I was the one who said Douglas. I'm like, did they just say Douglas? And he said, that's interesting. Douglas is our current worshipful master. Oh. His father was a Mason. He died at a young age, and I'm pretty sure with the mansion, there was a Mason who actually died, had a heart attack. I'm almost positive that's who it was. Oh. So I'm getting these responses, clear as day. This never happens. I'm getting this message. They have a message for everybody, and it's for this person, Douglas, who happens to be the worshipful master. I had no clue about that. So it was weird how this happened. Is one of my few experiences. And it seemed to me like this convergence of all these different things. So I was there. I happened to be there on August 1st, 2014, 100 years to the day of the chain of events. I'm a Freemason, so I have that connection right there. Mm-hmm. And you know what else August 1st is? August 1st is my birthday. So, the idea is that that sometimes on certain times, events or days or whatever, the veil is thinner between the living and the dead. And to me, I barely have had any experiences. This was the one experience that I always look back on, and it seems to be a convergence of all these things, and that's the only reason why I think it happened. Because of the dates, the anniversaries, me being a Mason, and my birthday. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. So it was this pretty amazing experience, one of the few that I have had in thousands of hours of doing it, that I look back on, and it makes me think, it gives me less anxiety about death.
Less anxiety about death.
And you know what I actually did, and I think a lot of people, you come on, you talk about ghosts, and they don't really have the proof is in the pudding. So what I did, I figured we might talk about this. I posted on my website, and I also posted on social media, and they can listen to some of these clips. And
great.
Yeah, so if you hear what I'm hearing, great. If you say I'm just a crock of shit, I don't know what I'm talking about, I'd love to hear that. Go to my website. It's themindseyemedia.com. My Facebook and Twitter pages are at Mind's Eye Show. I posted it there. You can listen, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, your thoughts, and then the listeners' thoughts too. So I'd love to, after you listen to it, let me know.
Okay, and I will put those links on.
I can send you the videos too if you want, and then you can have it on your website too.
Yes, that would be great. I'll put links to all of that on the episode page. This
you
is
said
episode
before,
Q3.
my role was the skeptical believer, right?
Yep.
So I think these things happen. I think they're extremely rare, and I don't believe anything unless I have some type of proof. So if I'm going to make these claims, I got to have some type of proof, right?
Proof. Yeah, and I will...
Or something to back it up, at least.
Yeah. Yeah, and so people, I'm sure, will be interested in seeing and hearing that for themselves, and there will be links to those items that you just mentioned on the episode page, episode Q3 at speakingofjung.com, and also on Brian's website, themindseyemedia.com. So are there any other experiences that you would like to share with us as far as the spirit world or that dimension?
So I was a pretty big, like I said before, I was a pretty big investigator for about 6 years or so. Really intense 100 investigations, but I've kind of walked away from that. Probably actually even this event kind of probably prompted that a little bit. I feel like I don't need to investigate as much because now I have something to kind of look at, right? But I'm always still doing research. I love history. I love ghost stories. I love looking at haunted places. And so if you want, I would be more than happy to share one of those stories that I think actually have some type of substantive history behind it.
Okay.
So George Washington, his ghost is
That's so weird. I was just thinking about him earlier.
Why were you thinking about him? I want to know.
Well, you were talking about presidents and Freemasonry.
Right.
And I thought George Washington was a Freemason. I wonder if he's going to bring that up.
Yeah, so he has a lot of ghost stories. Here you can hear my dog jumping on my lap right there, probably.
I missed it.
So the ghost of George Washington, it's seen everywhere, and it's seen throughout different time periods.
What?
Seen at his home pretty quickly after his death. It's his ghost has been seen. It was really big during the Civil War. The Union soldiers claimed seeing him at Battle of Gettysburg, claiming to help them point in the right direction, helping rally the troops, talking to General Chamberlain. And General Joshua Chamberlain, he didn't even deny this. He was more of he didn't deny it because it was a really big rallying point that we saw George Washington and helped them rally the troops. So he didn't want to deny it. But, a lot of things I just said, it sounds like propaganda, right? But in my research, I found something that I think is overlooked when it comes to George Washington ghost stories, and I think has, pretty reliable background of sorts. So I found this memoir. It's from Josiah Quincy Jr. He was a pretty prominent Boston politician in the early 1800s. His father, Senior, Quincy Sr., was also a prominent politician. So, if you're looking at from a way, you can't trust a politician, but at that time, I feel like we could trust these people.
Yeah.
So he, in his own memoirs, he recalled what he called my father's ghost story. So Quincy Sr. used to tell this ghost story at the dinner table. It was 1806. It's about 7 years after George Washington's death, and he was staying at Mount Vernon, which was George Washington's estate. At the time, it was it was owned by George Bushrod Washington after his death, or I guess he was like the estate manager or whatever. So he was staying in the guest room that Josiah Quincy Sr. was in, was the same exact room that George Washington passed away in. And he was known to visit the people who were staying there, and George Bushrod Washington actually warned him that could happen. And so his father's ghost story, he doesn't really go into the details of what happened, but he said an encounter happened. And I quote, if he was to, the reason why he didn't talk about the details was because if he did, he would have to, quote, go see an expert in cerebral illusions. So to me, that's a pretty prominent old school source that also happened pretty close to after the death of George Washington. And he proposed that the reason why it is because George Washington's original crypt was deteriorating from all these relic hunters, or what he thought was relic hunters. I actually have a different theory of why I think Washington, if he did linger, was the reason for it. And it's politically based. If you want to hear it, I'm more than happy to tell you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So I think he was right when it came to the crypt. So George Washington, he was still in the family crypt, but classic George Washington being George Washington, he had a whole new burial crypt planned for him, Martha, and the family, a whole new nice one to be updated for him after his death. He had all the finances ready and everything for it. But, classic politician, that politics, that didn't really happen, so he died. And, he had this plan to be buried in the crypt, but Martha Washington, his wife, was getting a considerable amount of pressure from Congress. The people, politicians, they wanted George to be buried in the Capitol. And she succumbed to it. So she allowed them to make plans for it, and he was pretty much in that original crypt that he was buried in, even not the crypt that he wanted to be in. So for 40 years, his body languished there. Almost 40 years. And the reason why is politics as usual. The politicians, they couldn't, they squabbled over finances, over freaking building materials. Should this be marble or, whatever it is.
Right.
And that happened for 40 years. Our first president, against his wishes, they pretty much, so, there was one last push at the centennial of George Washington's birth, around 1837 to make this happen in the Capitol. And then at the time, John A. Washington, who I guess was owning Mount Vernon at the time, he was just like, screw this, I'm putting this to a halt. And he just wouldn't let it happen. And finally, or I guess a few years before 1830, this all happened. And then finally, he put a halt to this, and the crypt was built, and Washington was finally laid to rest in the burial crypt that he wanted, almost 40 years after his death. And I think, there's that idea that, people, that spirits linger if they have something, business, unfinished business to attend to. And I think if this was true, that may have been the reason why. And that's not, you're never really going to hear that story.
No.
And the reason why I heard that story is because for this book, I was doing some research. I went down to Mount Vernon, and
did you?
And this was one of the stories that is told there. And I actually saw the memoirs and all that stuff. So.
It's told there,
and it's on their web. Yeah, it's on their website. You can go to Mount Vernon, whatever the website it is, and it is on their website. I tried talking to them to see if I could get an official employee to talk about it, but they don't want to talk about it. So I went down to Mount Vernon, and I actually spoke to some of the employees there. And they didn't talk to the story, but they confirmed that to this day they're still getting some paranormal stuff. There are people with sensation of getting touched, of hearing voices, seeing apparitions of legs or something like that. So the stories of George Washington remain to this day, and his spirit linger in there to this day. I think that one story with Josiah Quincy Jr. is pretty substantive in my opinion.
Yeah. Wow. So the U.S. Capitol is that where he's buried?
No, he's in Mount Vernon right now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, he's in Mount Vernon right now. And just kind of another no, please.
No, you go.
No, I was going to say that just like while I was there, I found out you hear all these stories about George Washington and the ghost there. But then when I was there, I spoke to some of the employees, and they told me about something that really, some paranormal activity that isn't really known about. So there's an area in Mount Vernon where, the slaves are buried, and supposedly recently at that time when I was visiting in 2014, 2015, that there was some activity being stirred up. And it just so happened at the same time they were doing some quasi non-invasive archaeological dig there. And that's another theory, right? That spirits can be, activity can happen when construction happens. So interesting that there's some activity there, and one that I found out that wasn't really talked about. That kind of goes with some of the theories of why activity happens.
Right, when construction happens.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else we haven't talked about? Is there anything?
Yeah, this has been pretty.
It's almost 2 hours.
This has been pretty wide ranging, I say. No, and I think that is a great, and I think that's perfect because it's a perfect microcosm of my show. You never know what you're going to get. I would say that I also talk about conspiracies. We've done some things about JFK, and although mainly the Mind's Eye is podcast, I've done a couple blogs, and I wrote one a few years ago about Martin Luther King, which I think is pretty interesting. love to tell you about it if you want to touch on it.
You wrote a blog piece about MLK?
And about the assassination of MLK and the possibilities of a
us.
conspiracy. So I've always been a big JFK conspiracy. I mean, that's the big one, right?
Right.
And if I'm being completely honest, I don't believe Oswald was the lone gunman. And I think a lot of people agree with me with that now. But I was never really one to look at the Martin Luther King conspiracy. I was kind of bought into that James Earl Ray was the guy, or never even really questioned it. So I've done a lot of, like I was telling you, I do a lot of research about history. I do a little bit of road tripping, and one of these road trips kind of prompted me to re-examine the MLK assassination, and what I kind of came up with was some pretty disturbing stuff that the government was quite possibly, or some faction of the government was behind it. And I'll go into some of the evidence, just because, when I make a claim, I try to back it up at least. And some of the evidence that I have it's been out there for a while, but they're from different time periods. And I think, not to be, that guy, but I think I was able to pool it into one area, into this blog.
Okay.
So I was inspired by my visit to the National Civil Rights Museum. It's in Memphis, and that essentially what that was, the Lorraine Motel where MLK was killed or shot down. They transferred that into the National Civil Rights Museum. It's this phenomenal museum. It's a really amazing educational tool. But they were having this exhibition, and you would never think this would be an exhibition from a museum like this. They called it Lingering Questions, and they looked at the potential for numerous other culprits other than James Earl Ray, who could be, responsible for it. Those, they said, Mafia, CIA, FBI, Memphis police, they all looked at the possibility of that. And I was like, wow, an educational place where MLK was killed, they're going to say that there's a possibility of conspiracy. Shit, I should probably look into this, right? Mm-hmm. So some of the evidence that I found that says, okay, so you don't have to believe me that it's MLK, but what if I told you Dr. King's family believed James Earl Ray, that he didn't kill MLK, because so James Earl Ray, he was in custody for about a year or so. It was on his 41st birthday, he admitted to killing MLK. And that essentially was just to avoid a public trial and the death penalty. A few days after that, he recanted his confession, and he wrote a letter to the judge. All these years later, the King family, they believe that James Earl Ray wasn't responsible for it. MLK's son, point blank, directly said to James Earl Ray, Dexter King, he said right to him, I believe you that he didn't do it. I believe you, and my family believes you, and I will do everything in our power to see you prevail. And they had a lawsuit of the same year. So this is actually a legal fact that 12 jurors, they said, they delivered a guilty verdict that said the government was responsible for Martin Luther King's death.
Oh, boy.
This is a legal fact in 1999, but you're not going to read that in the book. So the King family believe them, right? And that's one little bit of evidence. I'm not going to go over everything, but I'll give you some other stuff that may say otherwise, and I'll even tell you who I think it is. Because I'm not that guy, I'm going to tell you something. I'll tell you who I think it is.
Okay. Yeah.
So, like I said, MLK, their family believes it. So MLK father, he came out with a biography. In the biography, he talks about a visit from Martin Luther King just a couple of days before his visit to Memphis, where he was shot down and killed. And I quote, and this is him, several reliable sources, this is coming from Martin Luther King Jr., several reliable sources, both private and from within the federal government, concluded that attempts would soon be made on MLK's life. Money was involved. Professional killers were being recruited, with the implication that it was from within the federal government. Now, in the 70s, I believe it was, the HSCA, the United States House of Representatives Select Committee on Assassination, they were essentially created to investigate both JFK and MLK's death. They concluded about MLK that the FBI inadequately investigated the possibility of government involvement. Why would they inadequately do that? Well, the HSCA also said, and I quote, said about the FBI that they grossly abused and exceeded its legal authority and failed to consider the possibility that actions threatening bodily harm to Dr. King might be encouraged by the program being COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program. It was a secret surveillance program that was created to destabilize political leaders and movements like MLK. So if you disagree with the government, you would be under the COINTELPRO. He was under the investigation since the mid-1950s. So the HSCA said that the COINTELPRO encouraged people to do harm to MLK. I mean, and I won't go into all the tactics. You can read it on my website. So we know that the FBI, they didn't investigate it properly. They encouraged harm towards MLK. And then on the actual day of MLK's death in Memphis, Frank Hollerman, he was the Memphis Fire and Police Director. That position was responsible for the security provided to King on the day for his visit for the city. That position didn't even exist until months leading up to the King's assassination. And I'll tell you why that's important. So you can hear me. I'm getting riled up.
Okay. Yeah.
Because it pisses me off.
Yeah, go.
So he unexplainably, Frank Hollerman, transferred black firefighters who were stationed across the street from Lorraine Motel and who specifically requested to oversee King's security. He transferred them to another location unexplainably on the day of the assassination. You know who Frank Hollerman was? He was a retired FBI veteran. He worked directly with J. Edgar Hoover for 10 years as inspector in charge of the Washington, D.C. office. Of those 10 years, 8 of those years coincided with the COINTEL program. So obviously, but just what I'm telling you, I'm pointing the finger at the FBI and Hoover. I think there's too much evidence that tells you FBI had something to do with it. And now I'm going to be that guy. I told you who it is. Why would they want to kill Martin Luther King? Well, I'm going to make you go to my website and read that.
Okay. Okay.
So themindseyemedia.com, you can read the blog there, and that'll tell you why. And it also has other evidence that I just didn't talk about of why MLK was possibly assassinated by the federal government. So that's some disturbing information that I think I just shared, and it tells you kind of what was going on at that time. And I believe since that time, we really haven't recovered as a country. They killed all our leaders that were making a change.
They killed all our leaders that were making a change.
Yep.
Yeah.
And whether you agree with Malcolm X or not, he had people behind him and he was making a change. And there was evidence later on that he, before he was died, he was moving away from that extremism. So Martin Luther King, JFK, RFK, Malcolm King, Malcolm X. They killed all our leaders. And we've never recovered since.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow.
Okay, so I just gave you that information, right? I'm sure you're going to do, I prefer you do your own research, see my own information. What do you think?
I don't know what to think. I'm happy to hear you out, and I would love to read what you wrote because I haven't seen that yet. It's very disturbing. I love being an American. I'm an American citizen, and I support our country.
100%. And that's how you support it, by getting the real information, right?
Well, I also know that it's interesting that I have to clear my throat again. Please. Excuse me.
And trust me, I don't say any of this stuff lightly, and I don't want to say any of this stuff.
I can hear it in your voice.
Yeah, but this is where the path led me down. So.
Yeah. No, you didn't know what you were going to find, and that's what you found.
And like I said, I know this is like an often way of what people who argue stuff, they often start with, well, I was on the opposite side of the fence, but now I went this way. But that is the truth. I had no reason to think that MLK, that his assassination had, there was anything nefarious behind it, outside of the obvious, that there wasn't anything conspiratorial. But then when you look at the trail of evidence, it paints another picture.
Well, I don't like to comment on politics. I'm going to stop clearing my throat because clearly it's just going to be like this. So I don't like to comment on politics. I don't like to say anything disparaging about the government.
Sure.
My whole family, except for my dad, was born in Italy and came to this country, who took them in, and I'll always be grateful for that. I also know that, things aren't always pretty or rosy, and things are done sometimes that are very ugly. And I don't know what to say about that. What I was going to say earlier is that over the weekend, I happened to be lying in bed and not wanting to get out. And so I turned the TV on and A Few Good Men was on again. It's probably always on some channel. And at the very end of the movie, I think it's my favorite line of the movie because have you seen it?
Oh yeah, you can't handle the truth, of course.
Yeah. So Jack Nicholson's character says, you effing people, you have no idea what it takes to defend a nation. All you did was weaken a country today. And as cold and heartless and cruel as that is, we like to just, and I go on walks through my neighborhood and I see these beautiful townhouses and these beautiful residences, and I see kids and every once in a while, and I think everybody's just kind of living life, and we don't think about how fortunate we are and how
Sure, and that also depends on who you're talking to.
Easy we have it, yes.
And that also depends on who you're talking to, right? So if you were talking to people, well, then talk maybe talk to black people about the death of Martin Luther King and the effect that had on being an American citizen that time. So it's I get that perspective, but that's not the truth is, and that's not the way it is. I get it. We live in a fantastic country
today, but what is the truth today?
There is no truth. That's the problem. Your truth is what you believe.
Okay.
And truth has been corrupted.
So what are we supposed to do though? So I'm totally letting you have your perspective. I don't really have a perspective on this
not be lied to.
Know what you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's simple. Just don't lie to us. Be truthful. Say what it is. And I understand there's always a gray area. Listen, I think there are some times where that's a necessity. So, for example, Operation Paperclip, right, is where we brought over, thousands of Nazis over. And the reason why we did that is we wanted the science information. But if we didn't do that, then Russia was going to take them and absorb them and then get the information. So I get it. There's always a time and place where you have to work in the gray area. There's sometimes where you have to do bad things for the overall good. Killing Martin Luther King, killing JFK, that had nothing to do with good. It only had to do with bad and for greedy and horrible reasons. And we have and because of it, it's been hard to recover. And you can see that. I mean, there's been minimal politicians since there that you can trust since then.
And there were before.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, JFK, he was a piece of shit. I mean, he had his own piece of shit stuff going on. He was,
he was a piece of shit?
He wasn't a piece of shit overall, but he did some things that you could call him a piece of shit for. Infidelity. Same thing with Martin Luther King. That's why I don't put these people on pedestals, because they did things that you could, depending on what your ethics and morals are, they disagree with it. But they did good things, and they did great things. And the way that they were moving the country toward was for something that was for the people.
So they did good things and they did piece of shit things.
Yeah, that's what humans are. We're good. That's good and bad.
I think you can say that to some extent about all of us.
Sure, no, of course, but then there's the line. We all have these lines, and the problem is that those lines were crossed with those killings,
with the killings,
with the assassination of MLK, RFK, MLK.
Right, and they altered the course of our history.
Exactly.
Right. Well, I think what Jack Nicholson was my interpretation of what Jack Nicholson was trying to say in that scene is that we sleep at night and we live these lives in this country. And yes, some people have it harder than others. But if you compare, say, the hardest life in the United States to the best life in a third world country, would they be comparable?
Certain pockets, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. And so,
but comparatively on a mass level, no, of course not. America, nobody's arguing America is a great country and what we stand for. But because it's a great country, I can say these things. So yeah, I mean, I get the point that you're making. But
it comes at a price. These privileges we have, these comforts that we have, comes at a huge
Definitely,
price.
but I don't think that is related to the assassinations of MLK, JFK, and RFK.
Then what was the motive behind that?
The motive for FBI is, for example, J. Edgar Hoover, Martin Luther King was, in his eyes, was starting to, well, I didn't say I was going to say it, but I'll allude to it a little bit, that there was an idea that MLK could be running for president.
Okay.
Or would run for president at some point.
Yeah.
But at worst, he had the power to swerve the way people voted. And J. Hoover was really afraid of that. And I'll tell the rest. I want the listeners to read too.
Okay.
To read about. So.
Yeah. Okay. And again, we'll have links to that
Yes.
on the episode page at speakingofyoung.com, or you can go directly to Brian's website, which is the Mind's Eye Media, themindseyemedia.com. That's fascinating, and it is something that is to be continued and to be thought about. It's very serious.
Yeah, and I want to know what the listeners think about. Read the blog. Read the blog, and then tell me what you think. You can tell me I'm way off, or not. I love to hear the thoughts, and whether you agree or not.
Great.
Now I know Jung was big into synchronicity, right? You were like,
yep.
It's funny because this synchronicity didn't happen too long after our interview.
Oh, tell me.
I mean, is that part of the synchronicity? I don't know. But it's pretty interesting what happened. And this synchronicity happened at a time when I really needed it to happen. I guess I was looking for signs. Isn't that always how that works, right?
Yep.
So I was in a pretty bad mental rough place, actually. I was engaged to a woman for a long time. I'll call her Veronica. And after a pretty lengthy relationship, we got engaged. We didn't end up moving toward that next stage, toward the wedding. We broke up. And you can imagine I was pretty broken up over it. I was living in New York at the time. This was December 2015 when it all ended. And then, when you need a fresh start, where do you go? Of course, you go to the West Coast. So I ended up moving to LA. That's what prompted me moving there. I needed a fresh start at the time, something new. Go West, young man, right?
Yep.
So I ended up moving to LA. I was living with my brother for a few years. At the time, I owned my own business doing inspections. So I was lucky enough to be able to move around and still have the business. So I was there for about 8 months or so, and that was around about a year after the breakup. So I'll admit I was still in a pretty rough spot or so, and all of a sudden I started getting these calls from my ex-fiance's father. And just due to the nature of the job and the time difference, it was either too early for me to pick up or I was just on the job. So I never actually answered. This happened about 2 or 3 times. And after about 2 or 3 times, I was like, screw it. I got to give a call back. I got to know what's happening because you would never leave a voicemail. So this happened a couple of times over a couple of days. I finally called him back and I was like, what's up? Because this is like pretty close to the 1-year anniversary when this started happening. And if I'm being completely truthful, maybe I thought there's some type of reconciliation that could happen.
Yeah.
So it turns out it was nothing at all, right? It turns out that he had a new coworker whose name was Brian, and he meant to call him this whole time.
Oh my goodness.
And he was always good to me, so I wasn't going to be an asshole or talk any shit or anything like that,
right.
Because I knew he wasn't mean to be mean or malicious.
Yeah.
It was an accident. But truth be told, I probably set me into a pretty rough spot. And this conversation happened in the morning, right before I was about to go on some inspections. So for my job, I would go around LA and inspect homes. Some of them were pretty high value ones as well, celebrities and all that stuff. So I went to go do a inspection. I'm driving around LA. I'm in the hills of Hollywood. I lose all of my reception. I don't know which way to go at all to get to my next inspection. Right?
Happens there.
Oh God. And I was so angry. I was yelling, I was cursing, at one point, and, I combined with the frustration from what's going on with the ex-fiance's father and everything, the year anniversary, it just doubled down on everything. And I just kind of came to this freezing point. I stopped the car. And I just yelled at the top of my lungs, probably a few words I can't really repeat here. A few tears probably coming down.
Oh.
Yeah. So then I'm angry. I'm sorry. I'm like, okay, I got to get to this appointment, right? And I look up. I'm at a fork in the road, and I look up. One street sign says Veronica Way, which was the name of my my ex-fiance. The other way was the name of the road where I had to go to.
Wow.
So I could go to the left, the wrong way, the road named after my ex-fiance, or I can go to the right, the correct way. I mean, shit, if I don't know if that's like to me, that seems like a perfect.
That's beautiful.
So that actual physical moment of what was happening was reflecting my actual inner things that were going on. And so that happened, and, it started to help me kind of go in the right direction. But just a few days later, I had another synchronicity with the same thing.
What?
Yeah. So this is, and I don't have too many synchronicities, but this is something that will always stay. I mean, it sends shivers down my spine just thinking about it right now, these things back to back.
Okay.
So a couple of days later, after this inspection, after the call from the father, I had an appointment for this inspection. And for this inspection, it was a really high value place, so you always do appointments for it. So I was talking to this woman. Her name was Nicole Trunfio. I'm not into celebrity culture at all. Even when I was living there, I had no clue who she was. She had a British accent or something like that. So we set up an appointment. Turns out she's this model, right? So she told me, we set up the appointment. She said her assistant's going to meet me she's going to meet me at their place. So the same day so this is a couple of days after everything was happened. I have this appointment. I go to it. I meet the assistant at this Nicole Trunfio's place. I start off business as usual. I do the inspection on the outside. Then I go inside, and the first picture I see is presumably her. She's on her delayed honeymoon at this point, she said. And she is then, in the picture next to her is what is now, I guess, is her husband. And it turns out to be Gary Clark Jr. And you know Gary Clark Jr., what that means to me? I was in this so this breakup was happening, and I was listening to this one album pretty much on repeat. Gary Clark Jr.'s Black and Blue, which is his breakup album / like new relationship album. So this one album that was helping me through this thing the whole time. I ended up a couple days around the 1 year anniversary, a couple days after of this breakup, a couple days after, with the ex-fiance's father, I ended up inspecting the house of the person who helped me get through this breakup.
Wow.
So those things back to back within a couple of days of each other around the 1 year anniversary of the breakup, combine those two. I mean, those two things, like I said, chills right down my spine. I mean, those two things helped me get through and get me, on the right path to positivity again. And it's all because of these synchronicities.
No, but that's beautiful.
Yes,
I love that. Those are great examples. Those are the best examples I've heard in a long, long time. Thank you for sharing that with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for letting me.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we could wrap it up there.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I think this is a great point. I mean, Jung, synchronicity, mind's eye. Speaking of Jung, I mean, that's a perfect microcosm of all that right there. So
thanks for sharing everything with us tonight, Brian. I really loved having you on the show. Thank you.
My pleasure. I'm feeling a little exposed, but I like it.
Yeah, it's a weird feeling, isn't it?
Yeah, it's normally I'm on the other side of the mic just asking the questions. So thank you. And you had some great questions.
So with special thanks to my guest, Brian Turnof, this is Laura London, and you've been listening to a special quarantine edition of Speaking of Jung.
This is the Mind's Eye wrap-up. Hope you enjoyed listening to another side of me. If you loved it, if you hated it so much that you want more, there's a whole nother hour of it. I get even more personal with Laura, talking about my hometown of New York, my adopted city of Charm City, Baltimore, who my idols are in the industry, and the time Laura and I really met in person at Contact in the Desert, one of the biggest UFO conferences in the world. You'll also learn a little bit more about the history of Carl Jung and Oak Island. Listen to that extra hour now at speakingofjung.com. Right after that, go to my website so you can listen to the EVPs from the ghost story that I shared. And so you can read my blog, Don't Call It a Theory, The Conspiracy to Kill Martin Luther King Jr. Get all my sources now. Go to themindseyemedia.com, themindseyemedia.com. Next week, we're back to business as usual, where I ask the questions. This time, they're going to be directed at New York Times best-selling author Tom Clavin. He'll tell us about the true story of the most famous shootout in the Wild Wild West. Tom will dispel the myths and lies of the battle at OK Corral. It's featured in his book, Tombstone, The Earp Brothers, Doc Holliday, and The Vendetta Ride from Hell. He'll be here next week. I hope you will be too. Until then, be well and let well be. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for subscribing. I'm Brian Crystal, signing off for The Mind's Eye. The Mind's Eye podcast is available on all major platforms: Stitcher Radio, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and alike. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for subscribing.